When you look at Oregon's state forests, what do you see? Do you see trees, streams, wildlife, a place for people to go to escape their towns or cities, to experience nature? Or maybe you see all that, but you also see cash, timber jobs, what should be and once was the backbone of some rural communities. I'm Andrew Thien, and this is Beat Check with the Oregonian. Up next, a conversation with investigative reporter Ted Sickinger about his recent series on the myriad ways Oregon's Department of Forestry is failing, and the billion-dollar lawsuit filed by more than a dozen counties that argues the state isn't cutting enough trees and the counties have been left in the lurch.
And what they're looking for is to manage these state forests like industrial tree farms. And they make no bones about it. That's what they want. They do not want older trees being grown because those attract endangered species. And they're saying that the state is allowing these trees to get too old and we'll never be able to harvest them.
We talked about those issues, the state's $100 million wildfire woes, and much more. I think a lot of Oregonians, when they think of the outdoors, think of the national forests. But you, I'm sure, visited some of these state forests in your reporting. What do those look like? Can you describe the landscapes?
Yeah, they're a little different, and it depends where you are. If you go to the Mount Hood National Forest, those are big old-growth trees. Those don't exist on state forest land anymore. There are, I don't know, maybe less than 0.5% or just something in that neighborhood of state forest land that's actually old-growth timber. A lot of it is in the 50 to 70-year-old tree range. And, a good deal of it looks like just industrial forest land. It is a crop, and it's been planted for harvest. It's tight packed, densely packed, mono, species. What the department is trying to do, or has been trying to do since it put its existing forest management plan in place, is to actively create more complex forest structure that feels like these kinds of woods that you hike through, that have some very large trees, mixed species, a high canopy, a bunch of snags per acre, specifically trying to build that complex forest that that's prime wildlife habitat and for some species anyway.
How did you get onto this story?
I was approached by a guy this spring who was concerned that the Forestry Department's budget, not just the Forestry Department, but the State Forest Division's budget was out of control and that they were harvesting trees perhaps to keep up with their PERS costs. And as the government accountability reporter, one of the things that I've covered quite extensively in the past for the Oregonian is the public employees retirement system. And it would be no surprise that those costs were increasing pretty rapidly because they are across state government. But he, the consequence of this was he's saying, the department is being forced to clear-cut trees in order to cover its pension costs. I find that a really perverse outcome of some of the the problems we're having here. And he was uncertain about it, but thought it was sort of up my alleyway to look into. And I agreed. I thought that would be a strange consequence of of these pension problems we're having. So I began to look into it, and it became a little bit of an odyssey. The budget problems that the State Forest Division is having, and the backdrop to this. As it turns out, they have not been good at all in responding to Board of Forestry, which is their oversight board, has been looking for more information on the financial sustainability of the State Forest Division for years.
These are boards appointed by the governor, right? And these are folks who are serving voluntarily, but are supposed to be overseeing these agencies.
Right. And the agency, I think, it's kind of in a bunker mentality, and maybe feels like it is occasionally being bullied by some of the board members, but it has been, from what I've seen, non-responsive, very opaque, both in terms of what's driving their financial problems, how they have solved them and kept the agency afloat. And it's at this point, it's got two competing kind of priorities to solve the problem. One of is it's developing a new forest management plan. That's been under development for 6 years. And that is supposed to be a plan that will increase both financial and conservation outcomes. Mm-hmm. That is the directive from both Governor Kitzhaber, former Governor Kitzhaber, and from Kate Brown. And there are a lot of folks who feel like that's not attainable. There are trade-offs, and you're asking for a calorie-free hot fudge sundae there. You're just not going to get both.
Yeah, so maybe we could take a step back, and you could explain a little bit. I think a lot of, as the government accountability reporter, we're used to, or any civic reporter, people are concerned about their tax dollars going to X, Y, or Z. But with the forest department, it's not. My property taxes or your property taxes or, income tax. It's literally revenue from these trees, right? Can you explain how that works?
This is a department, or this division, the State Forest Division, is dependent entirely on the harvest revenues that they get off of 729,000 acres of state forests. And they don't get any general fund money. No taxpayer money goes into the agency, and every year the agency puts out an annual operating plan in which they put 230 to 250 million board feet of timber up for sale, which is sold to timber companies. They harvest it, and the revenues are split. 63.75% goes to these 15 counties. I think it is important to sort of understand where the forest came from, and that dates back to sort of the 1920s, where you had timber companies that were kind of pursuing this cut and run strategy, where they'd log an area, and then it was then unproductive land, and instead of continuing to pay property taxes on it, they would turn it over to the counties in lieu of taxes, or be foreclosed upon. And the counties ended up building up these fairly large pools of unproductive land on which they weren't earning any revenue, but they still had to protect from fire and pay the state to protect from fire. And that trend accelerated in the 1930s. You had some of the state's largest historical wildfires, the Tillamook Burn, which ultimately burned 300,000 acres in a series of 6 fires starting in 1933. The Great Depression, where a lot of logging companies and individual landowners went broke, and the counties ended up with this surfeit of unproductive land that they weren't earning any money on. They didn't have the money to manage it, reforest it, etc. That it had been burned over, salvaged, logged. A big part of Tillamook County was just this ashen moonscape out there that it would require state resources to rehabilitate that land. So I think it was Governor Sprague who recognized this problem, and there was a series of acts passed, the Forest Acquisition Acts, that allowed the counties to deed this land to the state, and the state then agreed to protect it from fire, rehabilitate it, and when the forestry production came back, to share a percentage of the revenues with the counties where the land was located. And that percentage has changed over the years, but today is 63.75% of the revenues go to counties off the top, and the rest is retained by the Oregon Department of Forestry in order to pay for managing this land, thinning it, arranging harvests, forest management.
I know it's it's counterintuitive for a lot of people to think of, but you are managing nature, right? I mean, the same thing with the Fish and Wildlife Service. You're managing wildlife, but it's it's hard to wrap your mind around, but that's their mission. That's what they do.
That's exactly right. And, it's expensive. Some of the things that they try and do are unsuccessful. And that contributes to their budget difficulties. Right now, they want to kind of change their management plan because they feel like some of these treatments that they do are ineffective and they're expensive and they're not creating the kind of habitat that they want. And I think the conservation community is worried that they're going to change their plans to just manage these more like industrial forests. And the pushback on that is that we do have the Forest Practices Act, and a lot of the timber companies say, look, we don't have to have, it's not either or. We can have all these values on the forest. We can create great habitat. We have the Forest Practices Act that has these protections in it for streams. Mm-hmm. So we live out here. We know how to do this right. And I again, these are actively managed for timber harvest. This is not the national forest, which is essentially shut down these days. These forests are being managed for crop.
So the Oregon Department of Forestry's financial issues aren't just due to the logging situation. Your reporting, it showed that wildfires and the state's ability to fight them is also tied up in this. Can you explain to folks a little bit what happens when there's a wildfire and how much money the state is in debt right now for past wildfire costs?
Well, the agency has three divisions. One of them is the Fire Protection Division. The other is the State Forest Division. The other is the Private Forest Division. And the Fire Protection Division is responsible for protecting state forests, protecting private landowners who pay a tax every year to pay for this protection surcharge for fire protection on their lands. The agency under contract with the BLM, with the Forest Service, also fights fire on federal lands. Federal lands are a huge part of Oregon's forest land base. They're 60% of it. Right. State forests are 3%, and private is maybe 35%. We have had back-to-back high fire seasons. 2019 was an exception, but there was a run of them from 2012 to 2018 that were huge on average. And what the department does is it sends out not only its own personnel, and it draws those personnel from across the agency. They call it a militia approach. So when there's a big fire and they have an incident response team that they're sending down to southern Oregon to fight on BLM land.
Yeah, the Chetco Bar fire, for example.
Right. They are drawing people from across the agency. They are emptying the hallways down in Salem and in the various districts in order to supply these personnel to fight these fires. And they are also coordinating response when the governor declares a conflagration. It's ODF that sort of is the lead agency in coordinating that response, and they are also responsible for collecting the bills. So these costs can be huge every year. I mean, even in 2019, which was a low fire year, it was $40 million that they had in receivables.
Wow.
And at present, they have about $125 million in outstanding fire receivables. And the agency says it was kind of caught off guard by these back-to-back seasons, but they also, it appears, badly mismanaged the administration of this. And they part of these, these uncollected fire costs. They go back to the 2013 fire season. They have finally billed for all the 2013-14 costs, although they haven't been paid for all of them. Still, some of the 2015 costs are uninvoiced, mm-hmm. and literally they have boxes and boxes of shift tickets from these fires and kind of equipment lists that they are sorting through, comparing to cost-sharing agreements and contracts that they have with federal agencies, auditing those numbers and then having to send out the invoice, and then there's some delay. FEMA apparently is, it takes forever to pay its bills. Yeah. So this is not, it's not unexpected, and it also mimics a problem that the U.S. Forest Service had called fire borrowing, where essentially Congress was not budgeting adequately for fire protection, and then the department would have to rob Peter to pay Paul, and undermine its other programs in order to pay its fire bills. And Oregon needs to come up with a similar solution. The solution at the federal level was to be able to access the FEMA funds for natural disasters, which one of our senators, Ron Wyden, was involved in arranging that. Mm-hmm. But the management problem that they have is significant as well. They said we didn't have adequate personnel to simply sort through this stuff and build this out. Another problem they had is they hadn't told their board that this was a problem for them and that this was a severe cash flow crisis, and it undermines activities in the rest of the agency. Brings everything to a halt.
Do you get a sense, Ted, if other states fight fires the same way? For example, when we look to California and see the wildfires going on there, are they, is it the same type of situation there where they're paying, the state's paying to fight fires all across the state and hoping that the Fed's paying back?
I don't have a great sense of that. I know CAL FIRE is a completely different setup. I'm not sure whether Washington or states like Colorado and Arizona, which have had some fairly large fire problems, it's something worth exploring in future stories. For sure.
Well,
the governor has now appointed a financial task force to oversee both the acceleration of the collection of these things as well as, how do we deal with this long term? What kind of funding structure do we want to put in place so that the agency isn't put in the position of robbing its other programs to pay these costs?
But regardless of how California pays or doesn't pay for this, it doesn't, you look down there and see what's happening there right now. We're recording this in late October. Wildfires are ravaging the state. If Oregon doesn't get its house in order, we're already fighting fires. Like you said, this year was a slow burn, and there's 40-odd million. Don't have to have a vivid imagination to wonder what might happen during a bad year.
No, I mean, the length and severity of fire seasons has been worsening due to climate change, and I think this is viewed as a problem that we really need to figure out because it's one that we're going to be dealing with on an ongoing basis.
We talked a little bit about how this story came into your orbit, but once you sink your teeth into something, can you describe a little bit to folks what your process is like when you tackled this story, kind of how you developed it as it went along?
Again, this came in as a tip to me because I cover the pension system a lot, that perhaps some of the budget problems within the State Forest Division were a function of their increasing PERS costs. It turns out one of their board members had been asking the same question successively at board meetings and getting nothing back from the department. And when I asked the same question, I said, can you give me your actual PERS costs over the last 6-7 years? They couldn't do it or wouldn't do it. And so I then got into their budget requests and their actual budgets for the last several biennia, and I was able to determine here's what the PERS costs are, and indeed they were a big problem. But I also at this point was asking other questions, and I wanted to know what are the cost drivers that are leading to this financially unsustainable situation that has been you guys have been complaining about since the Great Recession in 2008.
That's a decade ago now.
It's a decade, and they have been saying the same thing. Our current budget model is unsustainable. Well, fine. Show me, where does the money go? And that's a lot of the kind of reporting that I do is follow the money stories. And it was frustrating because the department was unable to come back to me with a line item list of their expenses. And board members have been asking the same questions. What are the levers that we can pull to change this? Or, what costs are out of control? And this department simply refused to provide it. So, again, I ended up in their budget requests. They did come back to me with sort of generalized areas of, here's some broad expense headings. This is how much we spend on services and supplies, for instance. But nothing particularly granular. which is really, what the board needs and, what the department really probably needs in order to determine this eventually. But I then ended up running across, some major cash flow issues that they were running into. And
so you end up having to go back through, again, these are budget requests made to the legislature, and you're kind of piecing that together because the state was either unwilling or unable to provide that information to the Oregonian and to the board members.
They did come back with some information, but not information that was easily understandable, that you could break down and really say, okay, here's the problem. They're spending, $4 million on endangered species surveys, every year. And that cost is going up. And I still don't have that information. Again, I don't think anyone's ever seen that level of detail at a board level on this. And until they do, they're not going to understand what's driving this problem.
So all that context is kind of the backdrop, Ted, for this lawsuit that 15 of these counties, or actually 14 of these counties, right, are participating in. Can you give a little bit of the background of why these counties are taking legal action against the state of Oregon?
Well, for a long time now, the counties, or many of the counties, have been complaining that the state is under-harvesting the state lands. Again, their mandate is to manage these lands for the greatest permanent value to the state of Oregon. And what they have done is filed 14 of the 15 counties and I think 150 special taxing districts. That'd be schools, ports, soil and conservation districts, all kinds of public safety, have filed a lawsuit alleging that the state has breached its contract with the counties by failing to maximize the harvest revenues from these state lands. Essentially what they're saying is when they deeded the lands back in, and it was over a period of 30 years that these lands came to the state, then in effect they had established a contract with the state, and that the meaning of greatest permanent value historically, at the time these lands were deeded, was timber revenue, and that it came down to dollars and cents. Maximum value is the harvest revenues, so maximize harvest revenues. The state's position is that in the Forest Acquisition Acts, they also mentioned recreation, clean air, clean water, other purposes, and that the lands were acquired for multiple purposes. Obviously, Oregon has changed over that 80-year period, and for a long time, these timberlands were not particularly productive. But when they were rehabilitated, replanted, and they'd grown for 50, 60 years, that's when this controversy began to percolate a little bit. And there were environmental lawsuits in the 80s and 90s to stop the state from harvesting the lands. And the state at that point decided to develop a new forest management plan and a far more explicit definition of greatest permanent value. And when they did that, and it's called the GPV rule in sort of the industry lexicon, they laid out a very specific hierarchy that named all these purposes. The forest management plan was adopted in 2001, and a lot of the state lands were kind of off limits. And that worked out to be not particularly financially viable to have half the forest off limits, and they had, over a period of time, lowered that to 40% of the landscape in 2009 and then 30% in 2011. And they have since been manipulating the 30% of the landscape that's designated as complex to bring more trees into the harvest bucket. But the counties contend that, all along, since 2001, they should have been harvesting at a much greater level. And they are seeking $1 billion in damages. And that is $35 million a year since 2001, plus a sum sufficient to generate that kind of revenue stream going forward. And they say, well, you can manage these lands however you want. But if you're going to do it that way, we still need the money as if you were maximizing the revenue off the land here.
So they're not disputing the tenets of the forest management plan as it's been adopted. They're saying this might be the rules of the forest, but if that's the case, you still owe us this money based on the maximum productiveness that you mentioned earlier.
Well, I think that's what their lawyer says now, but this industry was really, I mean, the lawsuit was launched with the support of the Oregon Forest Industries Council and two of the largest buyers of timber off the state forest, Hampton and Stimson Lumber. So, if you listen to the environmental community, this is still a land grab by the timber companies who were hoping to force a settlement from the state. Initially, we're seeking $1.4 billion in damages. They've revised that down to $1 billion. But if they were to succeed, that would be a vast settlement that the state would have to pay. I think it would be tied up in appeals for years and years. But, it could effectively lead, what they're looking for is to manage these state forests like industrial tree farms. And they make no bones about it. That's what they want. They do not want older trees being grown because those attract endangered species.
Right.
And they're saying that the state is allowing these trees to get too old and we'll never be able to harvest them. So, I think at this point, the state has not caved. It's not said we're going to settle this. So, I think the reasoning of the lawyer has become, look, you can manage these how you want, but we expect the money if you don't maximize harvest revenues.
Let's talk about the politics of the equation a little bit. Obviously, Governor Brown is a Democrat. Some of these areas are on the northern coast are, Betsy Johnson's a Democrat, and she's a powerful lawmaker. I mean, how involved is she politically in this, and what are the politics in Salem surrounding this? Because obviously there's going to be some degree of blowback no matter how this shakes out.
The rural counties have always held a lot of sway, and the timber companies in Salem, outsized to sort of what their economic influence is at this point. But, effectively they've had kind of a veto power on, state forest policy. And that means when the department comes in and it says, look, this formula that we've been under is no longer viable, we're just, it doesn't work anymore for us. The counties have been able to say, and the timber companies, no, we're not going to, get you $3 million for your recreation program out of the general fund. Mm-hmm. You're self-sustaining. Harvest more. And it, really has come back to that debate again and again is the state ought to be harvesting more. If you are, financially non-viable, cut more trees. And it's been a bit of a stalemate because they haven't succeeded in getting what they want out of the legislature, which was a bill in 2015, for instance, that said you need to up your harvest, and I forget what the specifics of it were, but to the numbers that you were originally modeling back in 2001, you had promised us a certain level of harvest. You haven't gotten there. But again, that hasn't passed. But you haven't been able to get out of this budget stalemate or budget straitjacket, as I put it in the story that I wrote. That, again, their hands are tied. If they have a certain level that they feel is sort of a sustainable harvest level, and they have been going above that in recent times to solve their budget issues. But, Betsy is obviously a powerful voice in Salem. She is a vocal supporter of, the counties. There's a whole slate of county commissioners and legislators who have, been stalwart in their sort of support of this revenue arrangement and getting more harvest off the state forest.
Let's take a break. So where do we go from here with this lawsuit?
Well, it is scheduled for trial. It is underway right now, and it's up to the jury. And this is a kind of interesting in that it's a pretty technical decision on their part that you wouldn't typically see put before a jury on sort of legislative intent. And, I think there are many people who feel that the court should have decided this. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of folks who feel like they shopped this down to Lynn County as the county that launched this for a favorable venue and judge. And they certainly, the state has not been performing well in the preamble to the trial. Its motions, it's lost, 19 of 20 maybe. And if a decision comes down, it's left to the jury to decide, okay, what did greatest permanent value mean back in 1941? Was it this multiple use, or was it maximizing revenues? And if it was maximizing revenues, what are the damages that these counties have incurred since 2001, when the state implemented this new forest management plan that sort of changed its harvest plans?
What's at stake for Oregonians who might not live or recreate in these forests, I guess? I mean, what should other folks think or care about? Why should they care about this?
Well, it could be a substantial sum of money that all counties, to these 21 other counties that don't have any state forests, essentially taxpayers are going to be responsible for, if there is a big settlement, for paying that. Yeah. And it will go to a very few counties. Again, it hasn't been determined if there's $1 billion settlement, let's say, how that is going to be distributed. But it probably will be based on either the acreage of state forests in particular counties or historical revenues that have come off of them. And that will lead to a very few counties getting a really large sum of money, and the rest of these 21 other counties, ending up really having to fund that. I think there are a lot, as the population has grown in Oregon, these forests in really all over the state have become a much larger destination for fishing, hunting, camping. The Oregon Forest Resource Institute does a survey every year on what Oregonians value about forest land in the state. And consistently what comes out on top of that is scenic values and nature. The economy does work in there, but it's not one of the top values that Oregonians as a whole have about their state forests. So, the value system in this state now maybe has a different view of these forests than, the counties where they're located.
I grew up in Jackson County, which is, used to be a very big timber area, and Boise Cascade shut down facilities there. It was more of a federal fight over logging on federal lands. But, that area, obviously a lot bigger than these coastal communities, but it's become this medical hub for Northern California, Southern Oregon. Some folks I know think, hey, folks on the coast, you're a tourism destination. Lean into that. The days of logging are gone. But some of your reporting had some really interesting insights from folks who live on the coast. Could you talk a little bit about the folks you talked to about that conundrum?
Right. Well, again, the forestry jobs that are out there, the logging, the mill jobs, trucking jobs, etc., those are still some of the best paid jobs in these rural communities. They pay full benefits. They've got medical, dental, 401k. And they have an outsized economic impact. And then there's the revenues from the state forests. Tourism, by contrast, pays well below the median county income levels, and these aren't benefited jobs for the most part. So I think there's some resentment that's the message from urban or valley legislators. Come on, lean in on tourism when hey, that's not paying the bill, and we need good paychecks out here. We need benefited family wage jobs, and they are few and far between. And the forestry industry and wood products still provides a good chunk of those in these counties. And with the shutdown of the federal forests, the state forests have become a much more important source of the logs that sustains those jobs.
And without those jobs, you got someone working at a local brewery, but they're not making $50,000-$60,000 a year with bennies.
Right, exactly.
Thank you so much for explaining this complex issue. It seems like a fire line is encircling ODF, and it's growing closer. That's the portrait that you painted. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. You can find a link to Ted's series in the episode notes. You can check out my stories on the transportation beat at OregonLive.com/commuting or follow me on Twitter @AndrewTheen. A reminder to subscribe to Beat Check anywhere you listen to podcasts to hear the latest episodes. If you like the show, please leave a rating or review to help us spread the word. Until next time.